Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Whole Tooth, a podcast all about sharks, rays and their underwater habitat, brought to you by the Save Our Seas Foundation. I'm your host, Isla, and every episode I sit down with a panel of experts in marine science and conservation to answer one of your questions about sharks and the oceans. Now, this week, make sure you have a full tank because we are taking a deep dive into the huge and very complex topic of the global shark fin trade to find out exactly what it is, why it exists, and what it means for shark populations across the world. I had the immense privilege of being able to pick the brains of international experts on the subject of trade in shark products and shark conservation, Ali Hood and Dr. Diego Cardeñosa. Ali has worked in marine conservation for more than 20 years, and her extensive career includes roles in the UK's Marine Biological Association and the British Antarctic Survey. In 2002, she joined the Shark Trust, a fantastic conservation charity based in the UK, focused on safeguarding the future of sharks through research, education, political action and collaboration. Ali is now the Director of Conservation for the Trust and works with a variety of stakeholders, including governments, NGOs and industry partners, to develop sustainable fisheries management and secure protection for sharks across the world. She was just awarded the International Fund for Animal Welfare's Marine Conservation Award for her astounding commitment to shark conservation, which is absolutely incredible. And Diego is an outstanding and globally renowned scientist studying various aspects of the international shark trade, including the use of DNA and forensics tools to basically identify which species are being traded and where they have come from. His work is helping to detect and mitigate illegal activity by making it easier for law enforcement officers in major trade hubs to identify threatened species on the market. And not only does Diego work at the international level, but he also works with local communities, such as artisanal shark fisheries in Guyana, to develop sustainable monitoring and management practices that work at all scales of governance. I could have honestly talked to Diego and Ali all day. They have so much knowledge and I learn so much from them. Not only do we discuss finning in great depth, but we also talked about how it is linked to a much bigger problem in overfishing, which is the biggest threat to sharks worldwide. We talk about some of the major problems with the shark trade as a whole, the impact on sharks, and how we might begin to overcome these issues to better protect vulnerable species. It's an immense challenge, but one that so desperately needs to be solved to safeguard the future of global shark populations. Now, before we get into the episode, I just wanted to drop a very, very quick note to mention that there are a couple of sound issues in this episode. So life does happen sometimes, and Diego had to catch a last-minute flight, but luckily for us, he was able to fit us in. But he is sitting in the airport while we recorded this episode, so you can hear a little bit of background noise. So it's not a huge problem, but I just wanted to make you aware before we jumped into the episode. All right, so we have quite a lot to get through. So without further ado, let's dive in. Thank you guys so much for coming on to chat to me. I'm so excited to talk to you. And today we do have quite a complex and meaty topic to get into, which is the shark fin trade. Pun not intended there, which can get quite serious. You know, we are talking about one of the elements of one of the biggest threats to sharks, which is overfishing in this episode. So, you know, it is quite a serious episode. But before we get into all of that, I do have a couple of questions that we like to ask all of our guests, which just helps us to sort of get into the swing of things and get into the start of the podcast. So my first question is, in your own words, who you are and what you do. So Ali, if we can start with you.
Hi, well, my name is Ali Hood and I'm Director of Conservation for the Shark Trust. And the Trust is a charity based in the UK, but our work is international in its interests. We work on issues of sustainable fisheries management and wildlife protection, all underpinned by issues of trade, consumption, aspects like that. So my work is very diverse. I deal with funding, project development, delivery campaigns. And as a science-based organisation, my personal work is focused on conservation advocacy. So working to persuade governments and industry and stakeholders to address issues of overfishing and the need for wildlife protection.
Fantastic. And Diego, the same question to you.
So I'm Diego Cardeñosa. I'm currently a postdoctoral associate at Florida International University. And the main of my work, even during my PhD, was directed to shark fin surveys in the largest markets of fins in Southeast Asia, mostly, more specifically, Hong Kong and China. And during the last years, we've conducted survey in those markets and also created tools for law enforcement officers around the world to detect illegal trade, especially on site-assisted sharks.
Brilliant. And I can't think of two better people to talk to me about this question today. Both the areas that you're in are bringing such different perspectives to this conversation. So, Ali, you're talking from the perspective of working with governments and campaigning and policy, and Diego, you're talking from the scientific perspective. And we'll get into that later on in the episode. But something that is very interesting to me and very interesting to our listeners as well is how you got to be where you are. So how you kind of landed in the positions that you're in. So Ali, I wondered if I could ask that question to you. So how did you wind up as director of conservation for the Shark Trust? What did your career journey look like?
It's a fascinating question for a number of reasons, but I've been with the Shark Trust for coming on 20 years now. And we've a great team of people, both within the trusts and within our collaborations, working with groups and individuals in many countries around the world. And given the challenges faced by sharks and rays, the work that we do remains really fresh. So my time here for this long has been because I'm constantly challenged with what we're trying to achieve as an organisation, even if some of those objectives are incredibly hard fought. Prior to the Shark Trust, I worked for the Marine Biological Association here in the UK, and I worked for a couple of years on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. In terms of academic approach and pathways, I studied for a graduate and postgraduate qualifications actually by chance here in Plymouth as well. So my life has revolved back round to Plymouth. It's down in the southwest of the UK, and it's a fantastic place to be if you're interested in marine science and conservation.
Yeah, it is a real marine hub of the UK, Plymouth, isn't it?
It's amazing. Yeah. There's so many institutes. The opportunity for students to volunteer, to engage in a wide range of different issues and activities is so positive. It really helps you see what's available and what paths are on offer to you.
Mm-hmm. And was marine conservation something that you were always interested in from a young age, or was it something that you kind of came to a little bit later on?
No, I think definitely I was, as a young child, I lived in Cyprus.
Oh, wow.
And I spent many an hour sitting on the seabed, quite literally with a rock in my lap so I could stay down for longer. I think that really set my interest in the marine environment. I never thought of doing anything different, to be honest, and nobody ever tried to steer me off that route. But I'm of the Cousteau generation. It was so inspiring to see what was out there and to learn what needed to be done to help preserve and protect and safeguard the future of our marine wildlife.
What an amazing beginning to marine conservation as well. And I love that picture of you just clinging onto a rock under the water, being like, please, I don't want to go up yet.
It's exactly that. My parents always say to people, she'll come up when she needs to, don't worry about her.
Your parents were very trusting. I don't think mine would have been too happy about that. But Diego, how about you? Was a scientific career, was that always your path, or how did you get into a career in science?
Yeah, I don't know if science was always my path, but always sharks have always been in my let's say my brain since I can remember, honestly. So as I grew up, I kind of understood that science was the correct path for what I wanted to do, and I think I followed a normal academic career like most scientists would do. So I did a bachelor's degree in biology, then I did a master's degree in biological sciences. Both theses in both degrees were shark related. So for my bachelor's degree, I studied the effects of habitat loss on juvenile lemon sharks in Bimini, Bahamas, with Dr. Samuel Gruber. And then for my master's, I studied the genetic population structure of pelagic pressure sharks throughout the Pacific coast. And then I was lucky that I was hired to go and work in Fiji for a year in a project by Projects Abroad, where we established like a shark conservation project there in the south coast of Vitilevu in Fiji. And then afterwards, I started my PhD under the mentorship of Dr. Damien Chapman at Stony Brook University. And yeah, now I'm a postdoctoral associate, and I think I will still pursuing the scientific endeavors for the rest of my career.
Yeah, amazing. And some absolutely spectacular places to have worked, especially with someone like Dr. Gruber as well, who, you know, was such a prominent figure in shark science and still is. Now, my next question is potentially quite a difficult one. All of my guests struggle with this one. And it is, what is your most memorable experience in the ocean?
So yeah, it's a difficult question because I have the privilege of experiencing quite a few ones that come to mind. But I believe the most memorable one would be diving at Malpelo Island in Colombia. I remember I was on a dive with one other person, and then we saw the schooling hammerheads, and they were quite a little bit far from the rock, so we went a little further to get to see them closer. And then when we were returning back to the rock, I was like, oh no, one last glance to the hammerheads. And when I turned back, a whale shark was coming through the school of hammerheads. So I was I was completely, amazed by that. And then we returned back and swam with the whale shark surrounded by hammerheads. I think yeah, nothing will top that one for me at least.
Wow. Oh my goodness. I mean, I've seen the footage of the school and hammerheads, and it just looks insane by itself, an incredible experience. And then to have the world's largest shark then just, casually swoop on by at the same time. That's madness. Ali, how about you? What was your most memorable experience?
I do think this is a really unfair question. It's like asking someone what their favourite shark is, and I always refuse to answer that one. You can't play favourites. It's, like Diego, I've been lucky to spend a lot of time in and under the water, both, associated to past lives and my own time. I mean, to be frank, as a conservation advocate, you don't get to spend a lot of time underwater. We enjoy that experience through our members, through our supporters, through the people we meet, and through our colleagues who are researchers out there in the water. But for me, one of the things that sprung to mind immediately, and it's kind of the complete polar opposite of Diego's experience there, with a mass abundance of animals. I was privileged to dive in the Maldives, and I came up on a safety stop, and it was pure blue water in all directions, apart from my buddy, of course. But out there, just sitting in line with us, was a single barracuda, and it was just sitting there stationary, staring at us for this whole period that we had to sit still, which just extended out in my mind, because it was just this incredibly pure and clean experience of perfect blue water and this one silverfish just staring us out. And it just really stuck in my head, alongside many other experiences, but that one, total opposite to Diego's abundance, but it was great. It was just a really awesome experience, really awesome.
Yeah, but that's why I love asking that question, because everybody's, as much as it puts people on the spot and everyone's like, oh no, I can't think of this, everyone's experience is so special for very, very different reasons. We do have a question that we need to answer today, which is, what is the fin trade and what does it mean for sharks? And as we've already discussed, this is, one element of the biggest threat to sharks globally, which is overfishing. But I really want to spend some time looking at finning itself and kind of breaking it down, because it is a very, very large and very complex issue. And I imagine, some of our listeners might not even realise that sharks are fished and there are shark products on the global market. So something I'd like to start us off with is by discussing what sharks are fished for. So what products might we find?
So in shark trade, you can find a lot of different aspects, from international trade to local consumption. So when a shark gets captured, it should get landed whole. That means with the fins naturally attached to their bodies, and then that's where a lot of the supply chain start. So in sharks, you can use the skin. So I've seen skins arriving to Hong Kong, I believe, for manufacturing purses or wallets, or like any other skin product. You can also find international meat trade of sharks. That's for protein consumption around the world, and you can pinpoint two different regions where most of the shark meat is being consumed, which is South America and Europe. In South America, Brazil specifically. And then you have the fins, which is the most valuable product of the shark by weight. And most of the fins get shipped to Southeast Asia, where they are consumed for a local dish, which is the shark fin soup. So I think those cover most of the international trade of sharks that you can see, and definitely the one that has been portrayed in the media, and rightly so, because it's been a large threat for sharks for many, many decades, is the international shark fin trade, specifically to China and Hong Kong.
But as Diego said, there's a very complex trade there, a lot of which does start on that first point of landing. And then you see whether it's meat, fins, skin, cartilage, oil, all going off into different dimensions of the market. Yeah, I think your listeners would be really surprised as to where shark products do turn up. So in some day-to-day items that they might encounter, from cosmetics through to supposed health products. So shark fin products do appear across the market in so many forms, and not just in the sort of what would come to mind first, so fins or meat sold on a market. And I think it's really important that people appreciate that broad use of shark products, each of which has a different driver within the trade.
Yes, it's interesting that you mentioned the cosmetics and other products that we might use in our day-to-day basis, in our daily lives. A few years ago, I did a study where I analyzed pet food specifically and cosmetics. And I found the results, I couldn't believe what I found. Basically, 70% of the products that I tested had mako shark, which is very, it was crazy. So yes. Our cats are eating mako shark, which is quite striking, because in the labels of the pet foods, you don't see shark or shark related products or shark meat, anything that is related to let the consumer know that you are buying a product that contains shark. And also we tested some cosmetics that in the label said squalene. They actually had squalene, and I wanted to see if I can find some traces of DNA within the cosmetics, and I found blue shark and scallop hammerhead in cosmetics that we put on our faces, our skins, every day. So that's another one that was quite striking.
For anyone listening who's wondering, squalene is the liver oil that is used in a huge variety of things, from face serums to lubricants, an astounding amount of things in the cosmetics industry. It's unbelievable the amount of shark products that are in, you know, the day-to-day things that we use. You've now got me worried that about my own dog's food as well. I was going to say Haggis's food, but then I remembered that not everyone realizes my dog is called Haggis, and that's probably a little bit confusing for listeners. But yeah, to bring us back to the concept of finning, I mean, a lot of the issues that we're talking about, you know, they all come into one when we're talking about finning as well, because finning is part of overfishing. But you touched on this briefly earlier, Ali, which was that finning, the definition of finning as it stands at the moment is, you know, different to what Diego was talking about there, where you land a shark with the fins on and then remove the fins when it's been brought back into shore. So can you explain what the definition of finning actually is?
Yeah, so I mean, shark finning is the removal of shark fins at sea and the discard of carcass overboard. So the only thing retained is the shark fin. Obviously, this is a highly wasteful practice and, in fact, a major barrier to effective shark fisheries management. We then have management processes which involve what they call fin to carcass ratios, where you are allowed to remove the fin at sea, but you must retain the carcass of the shark. You can dress that carcass, you can eviscerate it, so you're removing its head. It's just the trunk of the shark is left, and the fins are kept separately, and they may be kept in primary or secondary fin sets, and I'm sure Diego can go into that in much more detail. But the problems you have there is that you're reliant on honesty. You're reliant on people saying, yes, this is one set of fins from one shark. But given you could perhaps transship, so you could take the fins off one vessel and trade them onto another vessel, or you could land them at one port and keep the carcasses for a different port, depending on your markets, it becomes incredibly easy for this system to be abused. You may have high grading of fins where larger fins are kept with smaller carcasses, or you may, because of the generous nature of the fin to carcass ratio, be able to land more sets of fins, i.e. from more sharks, than carcasses, and still be within the limits of the regulation. And so this brings us on to something that both Diego and I have mentioned, which is landing sharks with their fins still naturally attached. So the shark has to have its fin. It can have what's called a partial cut, where you cut the fin and flap the fins against the carcass, but it eliminates the opportunity for those fins to have been removed, for finning to have occurred in that instance. It eases the burden of enforcement. So if we have a vessel from European nation landing into, say, South Africa or an Indian Ocean port, the enforcement officers there just need to look on the vessel and say, fins are attached to the carcasses, they are compliant with that regulation. So it's much, much simpler and feeds a much more quality data into the fisheries management process. And, you know, you rightly keep referencing finning as an element of overfishing. To start that effective process of fisheries management, we need to know what's being caught. And as we don't all have Diego's mobile sequencer, we need to be able to identify the sharks as they come into port. And it's incredibly valuable, much easier to identify a shark that still has its fins naturally attached than just the trunk of a shark with its fins removed.
Absolutely, yeah. I think quite a lot of people are, you know, shocked by what the practice of finning actually entails, because, you know, we hear about fins being sold on the market, and for someone that doesn't know much about the process, they might just assume that everybody just brings, you know, the whole shark back to shore, and then the various different parts get processed and then, you know, sold. But the reason why finning gets so much media attention, and the reason why it's such a huge issue, is because of that, you know, the quite cruel and brutal nature of it. I mean, you're cutting the fins off the shark and then throwing the shark back into sea sometimes. So I think a lot of people are quite shocked by that. But something I wanted to come back to, which we did talk about earlier, but I just wanted to talk about it in a little bit more detail, is why people want the fins specifically. So what is it about the fins that make them such a marketable product? Because as Diego said, they are the most valuable shark product on the market. So why do people want fins? Where is that demand coming from?
When shark finning started, it was just a matter of getting more price or getting more value of your fishing trip every time you go out at sea, because you can fill your boat with fins, which at that time were way more valuable than anything else that a shark can give to you. So if you come back from the sea with a hull of your ship full of shark fins, that's maximizing the money that you were gonna get for that fishing trip. So that's the reason for it, and the reason that people were and are still paying so high for the fins is because it's considered a delicacy in China and Southeast Asia. Basically, it's just for the consumption of the shark fin soup. But also, I just want to say that even that uh, when you see a lot of the media and like even general public campaigns advocating against shark finning, the advocation against shark finning started many decades ago, and when you see the proportion of sharks now being landed whole versus a few decades ago, you can still see millions and millions and millions of sharks being landed with fins naturally attached. But getting rid of the shark finning problem is not solving much of the problems that sharks are facing at the moment, right? So I was just gonna say, when you see pictures still of shark landings in Spain or Indonesia or India or all these big catching nations, you still see the shark landed whole, but that's not fixing much of the shark fishing mortality that sharks have. And with the abolition, or like with the shark finning regulations that have been put in place in recent decades, the amount of shark meat being consumed and traded has been increasing, and also the value of the meat is increasing. So if you see the recent data that we have for that, almost the international shark fin trade and the international shark meat trade move the same amount of money. So the meat obviously moves more volume because it's less profitable as the fins, but in terms of net profits that you can do out of meat and fins, they're almost at the same point right now. So there's not really a deterrence for. I mean, there's not much of an idea to continue finning if you can have a profitable shark meat trade. Yeah. So if you throw a carcass back to the sea, you're just throwing money and actual money that is being more and more valuable with time.
I think Diego's touching on some very important points there, and absolutely there's a perception with some people who are involved in campaigns, and even we worry that the perception flows into governments as well, that if you address the fin trade, then shark conservation issues are solved. And as Diego has rightly said, the meat trade is also driving the retention of sharks. And so finning and banning finning and then going on to prohibit fin trade doesn't actually result in no sharks being caught and landed, because there is a demand there for the meat. And, we also hear, and I'm not saying this was exactly what Diego was trying to portray there, but that the regulation of finning activities has led to a demand and a market for shark meat. So as more carcasses have been landed, that has caused a market in itself. I would actually caution against that perspective, because we also need to look at the fact that sharks are caught both as target species, but also as bycatch with other species. And that those primary target species, whether it's swordfish or tuna or others, have declined. And as those species have declined, the importance of the shark meat, the sharks as a value to those fisheries, has increased. And so you see the decline in swordfish, you see the increase in importance of, say, blue shark, if you're looking at Atlantic longline fisheries. And it's a really important thing to appreciate there, that the regulations haven't been the sole driver of the trade in meat, and therefore caused, a situation that you could almost say was an own goal. That's not that's not the case. The case here is that the blue shark have become more valuable to the economy of those fisheries because their target species have declined.
Well, I guess you can argue for both, right? Or a combination
Absolutely.
of both.
Absolutely. It's a combination, but it's always concerning when people, and Diego, I'm not suggesting this is what you're doing in any way, but we often get this sort of leveled at those who are involved in securing or seeking the securing of fins naturally attached, that it's the actual regulation of the fin trade that causes an increase in retention of carcasses. I mean, that's nonsensical. We can't encourage the continuation of finning to reduce that meat trade market. That's yeah.
I wanted to sort of move us on a little bit to the actual impact on shark species. So from the fin trade, I mean, we know that overfishing is a huge threat to sharks, but I wondered if we could talk about what finning actually means for the sharks themselves. So, how big of an impact has it had, and what does it actually mean for sharks in the wild?
I mean, I think that no one would argue that the fin trade wasn't the driver of many population declines for sharks, and that it's the unknown level and volume of trade that has, well, not of trade, but of finning activity that led to multiple shark populations declining at paces that went to an extent unseen for many, many, many years.
I think one let's say one data or one value that can give you an idea of how bad the shark fin trade is for sharks is that in the last assessment that the IUCN did for sharks, the baseline for all elasmobranchs or chondrichthyans was that 1/3 of the species are threatened with extinction. So that means they're either vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered, right? So that's 1/3. When we started this survey of the shark fin markets in Southeast Asia in 2014, when the previous assessment was released, already 1/3 of the fin trade was under threatened categories, right? So in 2014, 1/4 of the shark species were threatened with extinction, and 1/3 of the shark fin trade was composed of or comprised threatened species. Now, the IUCN report says 1/3 of the species globally are threatened with extinction, but our data in Hong Kong and China suggests that 70%, a little over 70% of the fin trade is comprised by threatened species. So that's double the baseline for the chondrichthyans globally. So that means that the international shark fin trade is based on threatened species. 2/3 of the international shark fin trade is based on threatened species. So that gives you an idea of how bad or how detrimental this practice is for shark populations.
I think that those are really compelling statistics that you've got there, Diego, and I'm assuming the majority of that remaining 30% is blue shark, or a great deal of that is blue shark.
Yeah, the large majority of the trade itself, it's blue shark. More than 1/3 of the fins that we analyze in the markets are blue shark. But when you check the top 10 species in trade in terms of how common they are, 9 out of 10 are threatened species. Wow. The only one that is not in threatened categories is the blue shark itself.
Yeah. I mean, Diego's mentioned a recent IUCN publication there, and I'd really recommend people have a look. There's not only the scientific paper, but there are also infographics, very accessible products around this paper, and it's Dulvey et al. It's 2021 in Current Biology. And, the statistic that the sort of headline statistic is that, 99.6% of chondrichthyans, so shark, skates, rays and chimera, are affected by fishing. And overfishing is the primary threat to 100% of the 391, that's Diego's 1/3, of species listed in a threat category. I mean, that's incredibly shocking. And the sort of historic start to that process would have been driven by, you know, for many species, by the fin trade. And that meat trade issue has come in more recent years. So it is, well, it's alarming to say the least. And many, if not all shark species, they've not historically been managed in the way of other bony fish. And so they've suffered from this double sort of whammy of being high value targets, as well as having no actual management.
Yeah, and there was another paper by the same group of scientists early on.
Yeah, I can link to that paper in the show notes.
Right, where they assessed the oceanic sharks. So that means the open ocean sharks and rays.
Yeah.
And that one suggested also that the population declines of shark populations around the world was 70% in the last, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's the last 4 decades. And it was due to an increase of 18-fold of the fishing pressure on those species. But then those are oceanic sharks. But when you go and see the status of reef sharks or reef associated sharks, there was a paper by McNeil et al. Last year that collected all the data from the largest survey of reef associated sharks in the world and showed that 2 out of 5 reefs that you go in the world in tropical areas have sharks that have been I think they call it functionally extinct. That means the abundance of sharks in those reefs is so low that they cannot fulfill their ecological role anymore. Wow. So if you combine those statistics with the statistics of the oceanic sharks, then you can see a pretty bad picture globally for those sharks.
Wow. Yeah.
I think it's also important for listeners to understand that this isn't just an issue in tropical waters either, in high seas waters. It's also, you know, we're here in the UK. We have a large number of our species around the UK. We have over 80 different species of shark, skate ray and chimera. And a large number of those are also in an IUCN threat category due to overfishing activities. And we're working very hard to improve the management of those species to try and facilitate population recovery at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, we also have the blue shark as well, which we mentioned. The blue shark is a visitor to UK waters, and I mean, personally for me, it was hugely shocking to hear, you know, that the blue shark is, you know, under such immense pressure from the shark trade. And something as well for our listeners to remember, we've discussed this in previous episodes too. Sharks are much longer lived, they're much slower to reproduce, which means that they find it much harder to recover from exploitation. But we are talking about the blue shark there, and the blue shark does have one of the highest reproductive rates of any shark species.
If you put the fishing pressure on any other shark, I think you will bring them to extinction quite quickly. So the reason that we can still have blue sharks and they're not in threatened categories, but near threatened or near threatened, is because of that reproductive capacity or production capacity that blue sharks have. However, I do believe that if we keep on the track of the fishing pressure that we're putting on blue sharks, I believe we're going to see blue sharks in threatened categories very soon.
So in the Atlantic, which is a high seas area which we've focused a lot of work on in recent years, blue sharks are a key element of the fishery there. They make the longline fisheries for swordfish. They're the economic element of that. It's what makes them economically viable. And the sharks represent over 75% of the landings within that swordfish fishery. So blue sharks are incredibly important. Only in recent years have they been acknowledged as targets within those fisheries. And in fact, in 2019, working with colleagues in the Shark League and other partners, we secured through ICAT, so that's the Atlantic High Seas RFMO, Regional Fisheries Management Organisation, we secured the first international catch limit for for sharks, and that is for the blue shark in the North and South Atlantic. Now, that catch limit was set at the highest end of the scientific advice, so there's definitely room for improvement. But I agree with Diego, if we do not manage this species, even if it is more fecund, even if it does mature earlier, have more young, the pressure that it's under will see its populations decline in a significant and devastating fashion. And within that same Atlantic fishery, we have mako sharks. And here you have a prime example of two species who have very, very different life history strategies. Blue shark maturing at 6 years old, mako maturing at 18 years old, having just a small number of pups. Blue shark much larger litters. And it's really important that both these species are managed in appropriate ways. We need to see no retention. That's the scientific advice for the mako sharks. Whereas the blue sharks, as we've said, have a scientific advice for a managed take. So it's really important that we address these things. But if I may just go back to the reference to bony fish, what I was referencing was that sharks have not had management in the way that bony fish have. So where you've had management for cod or hake or haddock, you have not had the same management for the elasmobranchs. The sharks were being landed with no limits, and this overfishing, because there was less requirement for recording, the populations were under great pressure, and we saw, due to their life histories, those populations collapse as a result, and it's a very slow process for rebuilding.
I wondered if we could explain a little bit about the regulations that currently exist, but also talk about CITES as well and kind of explain what that is, because I know we've mentioned CITES a couple of times throughout this podcast, and kind of what their role is there.
You can see the shark governance in different levels, so you can see at the international level, I think CITES, or the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, is the one that is the most relevant for sharks. So CITES, what does is that they have appendices where you can list species in Appendix 1 or Appendix 2. So Appendix 1 species are species that are completely banned for any commercial trade or commercial activity, while Appendix 2 species can still be traded, but you have to have certificates and permits that basically certify that the catch and the specimens that you're trading are sustainable, are traceable through the supply chain, and they are legal. So, CITES only takes into account international trade, but also at the regional level, you can see management bodies like Ali was saying, the ICAT, which is I think it's the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna. So those RFMOs, or regional fisheries management organizations, exist in the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. You have IOTC, and then you have several others in the Pacific Ocean. And those are the ones that regulate the fisheries in those areas, like how much of a shark can you catch, or if a shark is banned from any landing or retention, like, for example, the silky shark in ICAT or the thresher sharks in the IOTC. So several oceanic shark species are managed by these fisheries management bodies, but then you can have a discussion whether the compliance and enforcement within the RFMOs is the right one or not.
So I think, yes, what Diego is saying is very right. So CITES manages the trade, whereas the fisheries management bodies or organisations are responsible for the management of those fisheries, which includes their finning regulations. And we've seen improvements in finning regulation over the last few decades. We've spoken about this being an issue and regulation coming in over recent decades. The EU, for example, adopted its first finning ban in 2003. They then revised that in 2013 to move to fins naturally attached, away from that fin to carcass ratio that I discussed earlier, problematic issue of removal of fins and retention of carcasses at sea. And we are seeing the regional fisheries management organisations, an increasing number of those, adopt fins naturally attached as best practice. We've seen the GFCM, NAFO, so the Mediterranean, NAFO up in the Northwest Atlantic, NIAF in the Northeast Atlantic, the Caribbean. We've seen other parts of the world, moving to adopt fins naturally attached. And at ICAT, we have had over 80% support from the ICAT parties. So those nations that are part of ICAT, there's over 52 of those, including the EU. Only RFMOs are consensus decision making for us. So if you have one party who's not keen, then they can block the position of the others. And so this is a huge frustration where we know within ICAT we have significant support for fins naturally attached. But it's not just about the high seas areas. We also need to see domestic adoption and implementation of tighter finning regulations. So where we have these nations that are saying, yes, we agree with the concept of fins naturally attached to ICAT, we need them to look to their own domestic waters and adopt those as national policies. And it's really important that we then see this, the benefit of fins naturally attached applied to coastal species as well as to those high seas fisheries. And then the issue of compliance and implementation comes into play across the board.
Yeah, you can even see how difficult this is just complicated the enforcement of CITES is. So a few years after the first highly valuable and highly commercial species were listed on CITES, which was 2013, at the end of 2013 was when they were listed in Appendix 2. And I think the enforcement came in later in late 2014. That was the scallop hammerhead, the smooth hammerhead, the gray hammerhead, port beagle, and oceanic whitetip. And then a few years later, while we kept surveying the markets of Hong Kong and China, you can still see that CITES listed sharks are still among the most common shark species in the international shark trade. So that basically means there is still a lot of illegal trade occurring, and you can see it in the number of fins and the amount of fins that are being seized by the Hong Kong authorities. For example, last year, I think around May 4, and I know this very precisely because I defended my PhD thesis in May 5. They seized the largest amount of shark fins that came from CITES listed species in a single seizure that day, which was around 26 tons of silky sharks and pelagic thresher sharks that were coming from Ecuador. So that gives you and that was only one single container. So that gives you an idea of the pressure that of the enforcement and compliance that CITES has on these species. But there are tools and there are efforts that everybody and different organizations and different stakeholders are doing to improve this detection capacity and increase the enforcement and compliance of these regulations throughout the world.
I was just going to say, I mean, one of the things that I think has improved and is seeming to help, and Diego, again, have a much clearer idea on this, but is the simpler processes of identification of fins. So I was lucky enough to engage in a fin identification workshop and actually firsthand seeing the different fins from these different CITES listed species. It becomes more complicated as more species are listed, but looking at the current species listed, it is possible with the right training to identify the difference. Now, obviously, if you've got large sacks of fins coming through, things can be sorted through that. It can be very, very complicated. But those simple techniques of fin identification, now twinned with the much more technological processes, but accessible processes that Diego has been discussing, I think it really helps de-incentivize bringing fins in that nature. But there's obviously a long way to go on this, a very long way to go.
Yeah, and one just to add on what Ali said, one encouraging fact that occurred very recently is that, well, in the past, if you bring illegal wildlife trade to Hong Kong or other places, it was considered a minor crime. So the deterrence for illegal traders to do it was very low. Like if you get caught, you get a small fine, and then and everything's fine. Let's say there's not really a deterrence there for them to stop doing that. But very recently, Hong Kong included illegal wildlife trade and wildlife crimes into a serious crime and the ordinance of serious crime. So that will increase the penalties, that will increase the amount of investigations that is done behind every single seizure. And that also gives more incentives for the inspectors to do and to to catch illegal wildlife crime. Um, so yeah, I think that's an encouraging fact, and I think if more and more countries join um, this idea of that wildlife crimes and illegal wildlife trade is a serious crime and must be severely punished, then we can see higher levels of compliance, higher levels of enforcement, more funding and more resources put into these kind of efforts. So
Yeah.
I think that was very encouraging.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is a fabulous segue onto one of my next questions, which was, how do we overcome these problems in the industry, and what are some of the tools that we can use to do that? So something that you mentioned earlier, Diego, was all these, different levels of governance. So you've got kind of like the international level, but then you've also got, the groups of people on the ground, and the need to work at all these different levels to tackle the problems with the fin trade sort of in their entirety. So I wondered if we could maybe talk about some of those things in a little bit more detail. So I know we touched on the research there, but I just wanted to, ask how important is it to, fill these gaps with the science and with the data? So what can we do, or what scientific research still needs to be done, to help combat some of these problems? And I know, Diego, you're doing some of this right now.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, during my PhD, we developed tools that allow law enforcement to detect illegal CITES trade in fins and meat and other products that sometimes are not that easy to identify visually. So Hong Kong, for example, is doing the work where they identify fins visually when it's very easy. If they have doubts whether one fin is coming from a CITES listed species or not, they can use our DNA toolkit and they can have an answer from DNA within 3 hours to know whether it's a CITES listed species or not. There's shark fin guides that allow them to identify fins visually. That are very, very useful, low cost, and it's very simple to do. So in terms of research, I know a lot of my colleagues are working on bycatch reduction methods, and I think that's very key for sharks around the world. Like, find a way that we don't catch them as often as we do when it's unintentional.
Yeah, and also, there's an added element to that as well, is working with the actual fisheries themselves, the local communities as well, that rely on these industries, because I see the argument quite a lot of people saying that, if this is so bad for sharks, why don't we just, place a blanket ban on shark fisheries? But, a lot of local communities, especially in developing nations, they very, very heavily rely on these fisheries, to sustain their livelihood. So, I guess in a way, a part of tackling the problem is also working with these communities directly as well, and communicating the science with them also, as well as the national and international governments too.
Right. When you put into the mix the social dynamics and the social importance of as food and food security for many of the communities in developing countries, that becomes even a more complicated issue to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're talking about science as well, one of the trickiest things is actually, translating science into policy. So I wondered, Ali, if I could ask you a little bit about this, because, through the Shark Trust, you do a lot of work with governments. And I just wanted to ask you about some of the challenges associated with that, because I know it is hugely challenging, as translating that science into successful policy.
Absolutely. And I think, as Diego's mentioned, this is an incredibly complicated issue. There are so many factors at play, whether you're talking about food security or whether you're talking about a species in decline, in a threat status, critically endangered or otherwise. But one of the biggest challenges we have is a disconnect between the fisheries management ministries within countries and the environment ministries. We've been talking about things like CITES. You've also got the Convention on Migratory Species. So you have these wildlife vehicles, which are generally dealt with by the environment ministries. They're often political based decisions based on good science, but political decisions that are addressed by a voting scenario. So you can get species listed, and I'm not saying it's not a fight. The species that Diego mentioned earlier, those commercial species, it took a number of years to get some of those listed on CITES, a number of rounds of CITES meetings, conference of parties to get those listed. But the key thing then is what you do next. So the listing is one part of that process. And we then need to see these countries, these parties who have championed at times these species to then take the necessary additional steps. And so that creates an even more complicated environment that we're working within. But it is really important to persevere on these issues and to hold countries to account. So ensure that within the EU, they adopted fins naturally attached. We then need to see that there's an appropriate level of port inspection. Are infractions being identified? To what degree is that occurring? So the EU vessels, they are banned from removing shark fins at sea globally. So this makes the enforcement globally a lot easier. And that relates then to their domestic fisheries as well. But we need to see this flow out into other countries, whether we need to be assisting countries in updating their domestic regulations or using the fisheries management organisations to assist in that process as well. So it's a multifaceted issue, really, but incredibly important to continue to work through that process and to realise that the listing of species on, for example, CITES is just the start of the journey for that species.
Absolutely. And then kind of related to that, you've got this additional level of the public to the general public and the consumer, which we talked about right at the very, very beginning of this podcast. And I imagine for a lot of people sitting at home that have just listened to this entire podcast about how complex and difficult this issue is, maybe wondering what they at home can do to help.
I'd like to say that to your listeners, if you're inspired to, hopefully by the fact that you're listening to this episode, if you're inspired to help in shark conservation, there are a great number of really positive groups out there looking for assistance with their campaigns. Currently through the Shark League and the Rally for Mako's campaign, there's, if you look on social media, if you Google Shark League, Google Rally for Mako's, you'll find multiple opportunities to add your voice to a species that really needs urgent management. And those opportunities are now. We have key fisheries meetings coming up. This is a CITES listed species. It is a species that turns up in Diego's cat food. It really, really needs the scientific advice to be upheld. That is no retention in the North Atlantic. And we really value citizens from around the world adding their voice to this process.
Yes, definitely. There is so much that you can do. And I do have one final question before I let you go. I know, Diego, you are literally just about to board your flight. But very quickly, I just wanted to ask, if you could be any species of shark and ray in the world, what would you be and why? So, Diego, we'll come to you first.
That's a difficult one, but giving everything we spoke and giving the terrible trends that we have spoken right now, I would like to be like a very understudy and unknown species from the deep water where fisheries don't occur, so I can live a long and happy life. I think that would be my answer. If I choose any other shark that is more common, chances are that I wouldn't live a long and happy life.
That's both depressing and funny at the same time. But I completely get where you're coming from. Just kind of hide out in the deep, deep sea where no one can get
Hide
you.
out in the deep, deep sea where no one can find me, no one can fish me, and I'll be happy for many, many years.
Ali, how about you?
Oh, how can I follow Diego's comment there? How can I follow that? And as we said right at the beginning of this conversation, asking anyone in our community what their favourite shark is really, really unfair. I think today, given the week that we've been through with so much activity on our current campaigns, I fancy being a pajama shark. That will be it. Time for bed.
Pajama shark is definitely a good choice.
And not quite not quite, I did panic when you said that at the beginning of the episode, but it's not quite what your favourite shark is. It's just what you would be at this moment in time, which for me just changes on an hourly basis.
Exactly.
Depending on how I'm feeling. So but anyway, I will let you both go, but thank you so much for your time and for giving such detailed answers to these questions. It's been so fantastic to talk to both of you, and have a safe flight, Diego.
And just like that, we've reached the end of our episode on the fin trade, and wow, did we cover a lot of ground in an hour. Finning and the shark trade are such complex issues with many different facets to them, and it was so incredibly interesting and valuable to learn from Diego and Ali's expertise. If you would like to find out more about them, and I'm pretty certain that you do, you can find links to them, their work, and the organisations that they work for in the show notes of this episode. I've also popped in links to the 2 papers on shark declines and overfishing that they referenced. As Ali said, I would highly recommend giving them a read. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss the next one, and leave us a nice little review on iTunes. This just helps more people to find us and find out about how amazing sharks are, which, who doesn't want that? And if you would like a question answered on the podcast, or you just want to say hi, please feel free to get in touch by emailing isla@saveourseas.com. A massive thank you to our amazing guests, Diego and Ali, for their time, to David Knight, who provided the brilliant jingle you can hear right now, and to you at home for listening. Have a jawsome week, and I'll see you next time.